He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't dangerous. He didn't even think he was doing anything wrong. But one small legal mistake destroyed his career, his family, and his entire life. This is the story of Daniel Reeves, and the decision that cost him everything. Daniel Reeves was the kind of man people admired. At 38 years old, he had everything most people spend their lives chasing. A high-paying job in a tech company, a beautiful house in California, a wife who loved him, and a 6-year-old daughter who thought he was her hero. Every morning, Daniel followed the same routine. Coffee, emails, a quick kiss goodbye, and then off to work, where he managed multi-million-dollar client accounts. To the outside world, Daniel was successful, stable, safe. But behind that perfect life, there was something he didn't fully understand. The law. It all started on a random Tuesday afternoon. Daniel received an email from a client, urgent, aggressive, and threatening to pull out a $2 million contract. The issue? A delayed payment. The company hadn't processed it yet, but the client was furious. Daniel panicked. If this deal collapsed, it wouldn't just affect the company. It would affect his reputation. And in his world, reputation was everything. So he made a decision. A small one that didn't feel illegal. He opened the company's internal system and adjusted a financial entry. Just a temporary fix. Once the payment clears, I'll correct it, he told himself. No harm done. No one would notice. Right? For a few days, nothing happened. The client calmed down. The deal stayed intact. Daniel felt relieved. But then, something changed. An email from the internal audit team. Subject line: unusual transaction activity detected. His heart dropped. He opened the email. They were asking questions. Simple ones, but dangerous ones. Why was the entry modified? Who authorized it? Was this approved? Daniel froze. Because the truth was simple. Backhand index pointing right, no one had approved it. At that moment, Daniel had a choice. Tell the truth, or protect himself. And this is where everything changed. He replied, system error. I'll look into it. A lie. A small lie. But in legal terms, it wasn't small at all. Because now, it wasn't just a mistake. Backhand index pointing right, it was intentional misrepresentation. And that is where the law draws a hard line. Here's the truth most people don't understand. In the United States, backhand index pointing right, altering financial records, even temporarily, can be considered fraud. Even if you didn't steal money, you planned to fix it later, you had no bad intention. The law focuses on one thing. Backhand index pointing right, did you knowingly change official financial data? If yes, you're in dangerous territory. Daniel didn't know this. He thought intent mattered. But in law, backhand index pointing right actions matter more. Within a week, things escalated. Daniel was called into a meeting. HR was there. Legal team was there. Even someone from compliance. That's when he knew. This wasn't a small issue anymore. They asked him directly, did you alter the financial record? Silence. He could feel the room closing in on him. And for a moment, he almost told the truth. But fear took over. No, he said. Second lie. And this time, it would cost him everything. Because what Daniel didn't realize was, they already had the logs. They already had the proof. And now, it wasn't just about a mistake anymore. Backhand index pointing right, it was about fraud and deception. And in the next 48 hours, Daniel Reeves would go from a respected professional to a man facing criminal charges. The room was silent. He wasn't dangerous. Daniel sat across from three people. He didn't even think he was now controlled his future. But one small legal mistake, an HR destroyed his career, and a corporate his family, the attorney leaned forward, calm. This is the story of Daniel Reeves. Daniel, he said, and the decision that cost him everything. You again. Daniel Reeves was the financial records on March 14th at 38 years old. He had everything most people spend their lives chasing. If he said yes, high-paying job in a tech company, he could lose his job. A beautiful house in California. Maybe he could still fix this. A wife who loved him, right? And a 6-year-old daughter who thought he was her hero. But every morning, the attorney didn't respond immediately. Coffee. Instead, emails. He slowly turned his laptop around. And then off on the screen, where he managed multi-million-dollar client accounts. Timestamp. To the outside world, Daniel was successful. Everything. Stable. Every click safe. Daniel had made. But behind that perfect life, permanent, there was something. Would you like to change your answer? Understand? The attorney asked. It all started on a random Tuesday afternoon. Now, the Daniel received an email from a client. It was exposure. Urgent, aggressive,
Daniel's hands
and
started
threatening to
shaking.
pull out a $2 million
This must
contract.
be a mistake,
The
he
issue?
whispered.
A delayed
But deep
payment.
down,
The company
he knew it
hadn't
wasn't.
processed it
The
yet.
compliance
but the
officer
client
spoke
was
next.
furious. We also
Daniel
reviewed
panicked.
your email
If
response,
this deal collapsed,
she said.
it
You
wouldn't
claimed
just
it was a
affect the
system
company.
error. It would
Another
affect his
pause.
reputation.
Why did you say
And
that?
in his world,
That question hit
reputation
harder
was
than
everything.
anything else.
So he made a decision.
Because now,
A small
it wasn't
one.
about what he
One
did.
that didn't feel
Backhand
illegal.
index pointing
He
right,
opened
it
the
was about
company's
why he
internal
lied.
system.
Daniel
and
felt
adjusted
trapped.
a financial
Every
entry.
option in
Just
front
a
of him
temporary fix
led to disaster.
Once the payment
Finally,
clears,
he broke.
I'll correct it.
I was just
he
trying to
told
fix a
himself.
delay.
No
he
harm
said.
done. I didn't
No one
think
would
it was a
notice.
big deal, right? The
For
attorney
a few
nodded
days,
slowly. Nothing happened.
But his next words,
The client calmed
changed
down.
everything.
The deal stayed
Daniel,
intact.
he said.
Daniel
This is
felt
no
relieved.
longer an internal
But then
issue.
something changed.
This is a legal matter.
An email from the
Let's
internal
pause
audit
here,
team.
because this
Subject
is important.
line.
Unusual
Backhand index
transaction
pointing right in
activity
US law
detected.
Something
His
critical
heart dropped.
happens the moment
He opened
you
the
lie
email.
during an
They
internal
were asking
investigation.
It can
Simple ones,
escalate from,
but dangerous
a policy
ones.
violation.
Why was the entry
Backhand index
modified?
pointing right
Who
to a
authorized
criminal
it?
offense.
Was this approved?
Why?
Because
Daniel
now it
froze.
involves.
Because the
Heavy
truth
check
was
mark
simple.
intent. Backhand
Heavy
index
check mark
pointing right.
deception.
No one had approved
Heavy
it.
check mark
At that
possible
moment,
financial
Daniel had a
manipulation.
choice.
In
Simple
simple
truths.
terms, or
Backhand
protect
index
himself.
pointing right.
And
the
this
moment
is
Daniel
where
lied.
everything changed.
He crossed a legal
He
line.
replied.
2 days
System
later,
error. Daniel
I'll look
received a
into it.
call.
A lie.
Unknown number.
A small lie.
He answered.
But in legal
Is this
terms,
Daniel Reeves?
it wasn't small
Yes.
at all.
This
Because
is
now,
Special Agent
it wasn't
Carter
just
from
a
the
mistake.
Federal Bureau
Backhand
of
index
Investigation.
pointing right.
It
Silence.
was intentional
Real silence.
misrepresentation.
The kind that
And
makes
that
your entire
is where the
body
law
freeze.
draws a hard line.
Daniel felt his
Here's the
stomach
truth
drop.
most people
FBI,
don't understand.
That wasn't possible.
In the United States,
This was just a small
backhand
mistake.
index pointing right, altering
We'd like you to
financial
come in for a
records,
few questions,
even temporarily,
the agent said.
can be considered
voluntarily.
fraud. Even
That
if
word.
you didn't
Backhand
steal
index
money you
pointing
planned
right
to fix it later,
voluntarily.
you had
It
no
sounds
bad
harmless.
intention.
But
The
legally,
law focuses on
it's
one
anything
thing.
but.
Backhand
Here's
index
something
pointing
most
right.
people
Did
don't
you
know.
knowingly change
Backhand
official
index pointing
financial
right.
data when the
If
FBI
yes,
asks you to
you're
come
in dangerous
voluntarily?
territory.
You
Daniel
should
didn't
never
know
go
this.
alone.
He
You
thought
should always
intent
have a
mattered.
lawyer.
But in law,
Daniel didn't know
backhand
that.
index pointing
He thought
right.
actions matter
I'll just
more.
explain everything.
Within a week,
and this
things
will go
escalated.
away.
Daniel
That
was
belief
called into a meeting.
would cost him everything.
HR was there.
The FBI
Legal team
office
was
there.
colder than
Even
he
someone from
expected.
compliance.
Plain walls.
That's when he
No
knew.
windows.
This wasn't
Just
a small
table
issue anymore.
and 2 chairs.
They asked him directly.
Agent Carter sat
Did you
across
alter
from
the
him.
financial
No
record?
anger.
Silence.
No pressure.
He could
Just
feel the
calm,
room closing
controlled
in on
questioning.
him. And for
Daniel,
a moment,
he began. He almost
We're not
told the
here
truth.
to arrest you,
But fear
we
took
just want to
over.
understand
No,
what
he
happened.
said.
That
Second
sentence.
lie. And this
Backhand
time,
index pointing
it would
right.
cost him
It's
everything.
a classic interrogation
Because what Daniel
technique.
didn't realize
It makes you
was
feel safe.
they already had the
It lowers
logs.
your guard.
They already had
Daniel
the proof.
fell for it.
And now he started
It wasn't
talking.
just about a
explaining
mistake anymore.
Justifying.
Backhand index
Trying to
pointing
sound
right.
honest.
It was about fraud.
But every word
and
he said
deception
was
and
being
in the next
recorded,
48 hours,
analyzed. Daniel
and
Reeves would
potentially
go
used
from a
against him.
respected professional
Here's the truth.
to a man
Backhand
facing
index
criminal
pointing right.
charges, even if you're not under arrest. Anything you say to federal agents can be used in court. And worse, backhand index pointing right. If you accidentally say something incorrect, it can become false statement to a federal agent, which is backhand index pointing right, a separate criminal charge. Daniel didn't realize this. He thought he was helping himself, but in reality, he was building the case against him. After nearly an hour, Agent Carter closed his notebook. Then he said something Daniel would never forget. Daniel, based on what you've told us, we have reason to believe this may constitute financial fraud. Fraud. That word echoed in his mind, over and over again. This isn't what you think, Daniel said quickly. I didn't steal anything. Agent Carter nodded. I understand, he said. But intent isn't always the deciding factor. And just like that, Daniel realized something terrifying. Backhand index pointing right, this wasn't about what he meant to do. Backhand index pointing right, this was about what he actually did. That night, Daniel sat alone in his living room. His wife was asleep upstairs. His daughter's room light was still on. Everything looked normal, peaceful, safe. But Daniel knew the truth. His job was gone. His reputation was destroyed. And now, backhand index pointing right, he was under federal investigation. And in just a few days, he would face a decision that would determine whether he walked free or went to prison. 3 days later, it happened. A formal letter arrived. Stamped. Official. Final. Daniel stared at it for nearly a full minute before opening it. His hands were shaking. His heart felt heavy. He finally unfolded the paper. And there it was. Backhand index pointing right, United States District Court. Below that, the words that changed everything. Wire fraud, falsification of financial records, false statements to federal agents. 3 charges. Each one serious. Each one
capable of destroying his life. Daniel felt like the ground beneath him disappeared. Because now, backhand index pointing right, this wasn't a possibility anymore. Backhand index pointing right, this was real. That same day, Daniel hired a criminal defense attorney. Her name was Rachel Lawson. Sharp, experienced, calm under pressure. She reviewed everything. The logs, the emails, the FBI statements. Then she looked at Daniel and said something brutally honest. You made 3 critical mistakes. Daniel swallowed. What mistakes? She raised 3 fingers. First, you altered financial data. Second, you lied during an internal investigation. Third, you spoke to federal agents without legal representation. Silence. Heavy silence. Then she leaned forward. And the third mistake, backhand index pointing right, is the most dangerous one. Rachel explained the situation clearly. Right now, she said, the prosecution doesn't just have evidence. They have your own words. That's when Daniel realized something terrifying. Backhand index pointing right, the biggest evidence against him, was himself. Rachel continued. We have 2 options. Option 1. Backhand index pointing right, fight the case in court. Risk. Prison long trial, public exposure. Option 2. Backhand index pointing right, accept a plea deal. Admit partial guilt, reduced sentence, less damage. Daniel felt trapped. Both options were bad, but one was worse. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was full, quiet, formal, intense. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Daniel sat beside Rachel. Across from him, backhand index pointing right, the prosecution team. Confident, prepared, focused. The case began. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, this is a case of deliberate financial manipulation, followed by deception at multiple levels. Every word hit like a hammer. The prosecution presented their evidence. Heavy checkmark system logs. Heavy checkmark email records. Heavy checkmark FBI interview transcript. Then came the most damaging part. They played a recording. Daniel's voice. From the FBI interrogation. I didn't think it was a big deal. Hearing his own words in court was unbearable. Because now, backhand index pointing right, they sounded like a confession. Rachel stood up. Calm. Controlled. Your Honor, she began. My client did not act with criminal intent. She explained. No money was stolen, no personal gain, it was a temporary adjustment. Then she said something powerful. This was a mistake. Backhand index pointing right, not a crime. The courtroom was silent. But here's the harsh reality. Backhand index pointing right, in many legal cases, intent is not enough. The law also looks at heavy checkmark actions, heavy checkmark impact, heavy checkmark deception. And Daniel had all 3. During a break, Rachel pulled Daniel aside. They're offering a plea deal, she said. Daniel's heart stopped. What kind of deal? She looked at him seriously. Reduced charges. But you admit guilt. And if I don't? Daniel asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. You could face years in prison. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His wife sat beside him, silent, worried. What are you going to do? She asked. Daniel looked down. If he fought, he might lose everything. If he accepted, backhand index pointing right, he would lose everything. Because admitting guilt meant becoming a criminal. Forever. The next morning, Daniel walked into court. The judge looked at him. Mr. Reeves, he said, how do you plead? The entire room went silent. Rachel looked at him, waiting. The prosecutor watched closely. And Daniel took a deep breath. Because in that moment, he knew, backhand index pointing right, this one decision would define the rest of his life. He opened his mouth and spoke. But what he said, backhand index pointing right, would shock everyone in the courtroom. And in part 4, you'll see. Heavy checkmark his final plea. Heavy checkmark the judge's verdict. Heavy checkmark the punishment that changed everything. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on Daniel Reeves. Mr. Reeves, the judge repeated. How do you plead? Daniel took a deep breath. His heart was racing. His mind replayed everything. The email, the lie, the FBI interview, the courtroom. He looked at his lawyer. Rachel gave a small nod. This was it. No going back. Daniel spoke. Backhand index pointing right, guilty. A single word. But it echoed through the courtroom like thunder. His wife closed her eyes. The prosecutor wrote something down. And just like that,
Backhand index pointing right. Daniel Reeves officially became a convicted man. A guilty plea changes everything. Because now, there's no trial, no debate, no second chance. Only one thing remains. Backhand index pointing right sentencing. And in federal cases, sentencing is not simple. The judge considers heavy checkmark the crime, heavy checkmark the intent, heavy checkmark the damage, heavy checkmark the honesty of the defendant. And Daniel had one major problem. Backhand index pointing right, he lied multiple times. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood in court again. But this time, it felt different. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was waiting. The prosecutor stood first. "Your Honor," he said, "this case is about trust. When someone manipulates financial records and then lies repeatedly, it damages not just a company, backhand index pointing right, but the integrity of the system." Then came the number. "We recommend backhand index pointing right, 36 months in federal prison." 3 years. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His wife started crying quietly. Rachel stood up. This was her final chance. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "my client made a mistake. He did not steal. He did not profit. He acted under pressure and made a decision he deeply regrets." Then she added something powerful. "He has already lost everything." Backhand index pointing right, please don't take the rest of his life too. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked down at the file, then at Daniel. "Mr. Reeves," he began, "this case is not about a large crime, but it is about a serious violation of trust." He paused. "You altered official records. You lied during an investigation. And you misled federal agents." Every word felt heavier than the last. Then, the final sentence. Backhand index pointing right. "I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison." Gasps filled the room. Not 3 years. But still. Backhand index pointing right prison. Daniel closed his eyes. Because in that moment, everything ended. 6 months later, Daniel sat in a small prison cell. Cold walls. Simple bed. Silence. No emails. No meetings. No normal life. Just time. Time to think. He thought about that one moment. That one decision. That one lie. How something so small, backhand index pointing right, turned into something so big. Here's the truth most people never realize. Backhand index pointing right legal mistakes don't start as crimes. They start as pressure, fear, quick decisions. But what turns them into crimes is what you do next. Daniel didn't go to prison because of one action. Backhand index pointing right, he went because of the choices that followed. The lie, the cover-up, the wrong decisions. If there's one thing you should take from this story, it's this. Backhand index pointing right, never try to fix a mistake by hiding it. Because in law, the cover-up is often worse than the crime. Daniel Reeves had everything. A career, a family, a future, and all it took. Backhand index pointing right was one mistake. Backhand index pointing right and one lie. To lose it all. 18 months later, the prison gates opened. Daniel Reeves stepped outside. Free. But something felt strange. The air felt different. The world felt distant. He took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Freedom. But within seconds, he realized something terrifying. Backhand index pointing right, freedom didn't feel like freedom anymore. Daniel thought life would go back to normal. He was wrong. Because prison wasn't the hardest part. Backhand index pointing right, life after prison was. He went home. His wife hugged him. His daughter looked at him. But something had changed. She didn't run into his arms like before. That moment broke him more than prison ever did. A few weeks later, Daniel started applying for jobs. Same resume, same experience, same skills. But this time, backhand index pointing right, one difference. He had a criminal record. Every application asked the same question. Backhand index pointing right, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Daniel tried to ignore it, tried to move past it. But the law doesn't forget. He clicked. Backhand index pointing right, yes. And just like that, doors started closing. Here's something most people don't know. Backhand index pointing right, even after you serve your sentence, the punishment doesn't end. In the United States, heavy checkmark, many companies refuse to hire you. Heavy checkmark, financial jobs become impossible. Heavy checkmark, background checks expose everything. Daniel wasn't just unemployed. Backhand index pointing right, he was unemployable in his field. Savings ran out. Bills started piling up. The house, the car, the life he built, started slipping away. His wife tried to stay strong. But pressure changes people. Arguments became normal. Silence became heavy. And slowly, backhand index pointing right, everything he once had, started falling apart. Daniel stopped sleeping, stopped going out, stopped feeling like himself. Because now, he wasn't Daniel the professional. Backhand index pointing right, he was Daniel the convicted. And that label followed him everywhere. This is the part no one tells you. Backhand index pointing right, the legal system doesn't just punish your actions. Backhand index pointing right, it changes your identity. One record, one mistake, and suddenly, the world sees you differently. One night, Daniel sat alone, looking at old photos. His daughter smiling, his wife laughing, his old life. And he whispered something he wished he had said earlier. Backhand index pointing right. I should have told the truth. Not to the court, not to the FBI, but to himself. Because deep down, he always knew. Backhand index pointing right, that one small mistake wasn't the real problem. Backhand index pointing right, the lie was. If you're watching this, remember this one thing. Backhand index pointing right, mistakes happen. Everyone makes them. But what destroys lives? Backhand index pointing right is trying to hide them. Because in the legal world, truth might hurt you. Backhand index pointing right, but lies can destroy you. Daniel Reeves didn't lose his life in a moment. He lost it. Backhand index pointing right, one decision at a time.